Carmichael Will, all this work you've done, man, I know you got to come up here, man. Hey, Sammy, would you come up here, please? Yeah, that's right. Come on up here, man. Where's Stephen Briggs at? Hey, Steve. Where you at? Come on up here. The sound cool. You can leave the sound alone and come up here. Okay. Now, obviously, I have forgotten someone. Oh, yeah, well, Brother Alfred went back downstairs, right? Where's Spencer Hurst at? Spencer, come on up here, man. Oh, yeah, where's Tony at? I'm sorry. This is really a crime. Hey, Tony Lightfoot, where you at? Oh, all right. You want me to call Suderman up here? No, I'm not calling Suderman up here. He's on punishment. Okay. Now, what I want to say is this, these brothers, and this is on a serious tip. Without these brothers here, this program would not be functioning. One of these brothers, this brother here is teaching the Spanish class now for about 10 of the brothers in the program. And we're learning a little something, hopefully, right? Okay, this brother here, he's been working, Stephen Briggs here, he's been working, hooking up and organizing a philosophy class, and he's been dead in the case on it, and it's due to start in a couple weeks, right? But he's been give up a lot of energy for it, right? This brother here, Spencer Hurst, he's been up there in the library for the last few weeks, strategically going through all the books and getting little synopses out of the books so that we can improve our reading list so that everybody in the program can go down their reading list and see what a book is about and determine whether or not that book is relevant to what they want to research or look into, right? And of course, Harold here has videoed all this for the last 32 weeks, and some of us have seen the tapes, and these tapes that we watch is the results of his expertise, which he just gained in the last 31 weeks, right? And Wayne here, I don't know what to say. We got drinks over here today because of Wayne. I don't know how he got him over here, right? But we've been doing everything from cleaning up the ashtrays, mopping the floors and I'm not recognizing some people because they're not here. I know. Where's James Norris at? Is he here? James Norris, I definitely should recognize. Writing the papers, distributing the material. This brother here, Carmichael Will, runs up and down the tiers so that you'll get that material that's in your cell over on the weekend, right? And there's other people that help him. And I'm going to apologize to anybody that I'm not recognizing because a number of people have helped with the book processing. A number of people have helped with distributing things. A number of people have helped just arranging and rearranging and cleaning up the library, which is all part of this whole thing, right? What I'm saying is that this is our program. And this is the proof that it's our program because we do the work. And we get some help on a higher level in terms of things that we can't get, right? But as the weeks go on, what we're going to try to do is we're going to progress to the point where we can be totally and completely responsible for this program and see that it continues to exist and be beneficial to us, right? And what I want y'all to do for yourself and for these brothers here is give them a hand. And I got something special for them that they'll find out about later on, right? I do have something for y'all. That's not Khan. Okay. All right. That's not Khan. I got something for y'all.
When you say you got something for somebody,
Yeah, I got something for you in particular. Okay, last week we had a film up here. It was entitled Brothers. Oh, one thing I didn't recognize, and this is something before I get into that I want to say. We have been working with, we have developed a little committee, and a number of brothers have been meeting every Friday morning. I don't have the name of this committee right. Tony, you got the name of the committee. Give me the name of it. Moray Bay. No, just call it out to me. I just want to get people familiar. Okay, the Coalition to Develop Humanity in Prisons, right? And of course, we're interested in the 13th Amendment in particular and our humanity in general, right? And that 13th Amendment is that amendment that a couple of the speakers had talked about, and a couple of people from outside in other programs that came up and mentioned it. The 13th Amendment, the one that says that slavery don't exist in America except in prisons, you know. And of course, we know that we're not slaves. We don't have any desire to be slaves. So we are contributing some of our time and our energy to look into this, to do some research on it and find out whether or not we can't persuade some people that that amendment should be amended. And at the same time, whether or not out the process of that research and that, you know, a more enriched life and perspective within, among ourselves. The committee right now is short of 2 people. And we're going to try to get somebody interested in working with that committee. It's a very long-range project. And it's going to take some time, and it's going to take some energy. So if anybody's interested in getting down with some research and getting down with eventually some exposure and dealing with these things that affect us, then you can contact anybody that's on the staff, Moray Bay or myself or Tony Lightfoot or Harold Haskins, right? Okay. Now, as I was getting ready to say, last week we had a film up here, and it was Brothers. Most of the people saw the film. A lot of rap was exchanged, but not enough rap was exchanged. And I thought it was significant that this particular program here, you know, is using as part of its reading material, Blood in My Eye. Now, I recognize the fact that a lot of people didn't receive their books until Saturday or Sunday. And I know for a fact that it's impossible to read that book in that short a time, right? But I know a number of people have read that book. A number of people have read Solidarity Brothers. And a number of people have read Comrade George. And a number of people probably have read The Dragon Has Come. And basically, we have some ideas, you know, about George Jackson and that story and its perspective. Would you come up to the mic, if I could entice you, please?
You said that it was a excerpt from the book, that it wasn't the book Blood in My Eye by George Jackson. Is that true? Or
that material that you got in your...
I didn't get any material, so that's, you know, I can't, that's what I'm trying to find out about now. Was the book distributed or was...
Yes, what happened was, and you got to appreciate this and you got to check it out. I think about 4 months ago, we recognized the fact that we would need a copy of Blood in My Eye. And the director, Miss Vogel, called all the bookstores, all the book distributing companies, and tried to find that book. What happened was that the book was out of print. They did not print the book anymore, and they did not have the book in stock anywhere. So some kind of way around here, we had a brother Hadiki Barker, had one copy of that book. So we took that book and we Xeroxed it, and we got it reprinted. And then somebody sat down and co-related this, the whole entire book. And actually what we did, we went into the printing business, you know, here for the program, right, to get that book, you know. And I have a copy of it back there because I know I missed a couple people because of cell changes and whatnot. So you can get that copy I got back there.
Thank you.
Right? Yeah. We miss you too, right? Because your cell number's wrong. Okay, well, I got some more copies, right? Okay, but the point I was making was that some issues were brought up as a result of the film, and based upon the knowledge that we had of the brother and his life and his history, those issues was not resolved in last Monday night session, you know. And one thing that stuck in my mind in particular was that Dr. Anthony Gittin, or Tony, I don't know what you call it, said, if you didn't like the film, what would you do to change it? Or what would you do to make the film more realistic? And what I like to do now, until our speaker gets here, is to have a little dialogue. Because I heard a lot of rap in the yard Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you know. As a matter of fact, some people had told me in particular, you know, man, I didn't go up there because I didn't want to do that to myself because I heard it was a horrible film, you know. And now I'm not gonna take this position just to stimulate some dialogue, but I'm gonna say this. I think that film, and check this out. Now, I think that film, under the restrictions that doing a film of somebody else's life, you know, and under the restrictions of being liable for suit, you dig what I'm saying? I thought that film was a pretty serious job in terms of education. Now, I think some key points were made that were flashed across the country in that film in reference, one, to the brother not having his head on together until he got into those books. And once he started getting into those books, the change that it affected on him, I think that was a good issue in that film. And I think that was an issue that prisoners should have tuned in on. The fact that somewhere along the line, they had to change incidences so they wouldn't appear real and distort the reality of real life, I don't think takes away from the general message that the theme of the film was centered around. That here was a man that had developed himself. You come on, don't don't hold it in. Let's hear it.
Make sure I understand. You saying the film was deliberately distorted? I didn't see the film, right?
Yes.
You're saying it was deliberately distorted?
Without a doubt, it was distorted to protect the people that produced it. You know, it was distorted because they couldn't do the man's actual life story without doing a documentary or without getting, you know, some kind of official sanction from the man's people to do his actual life story. You can't do that to people.
What I'm saying,
yeah,
what
okay.
I want to say, I mean, you know, you're saying they couldn't do this without getting some sanction, right?
Right.
Now, and everybody that saw the film immediately knew who the film was depicting, right?
Without a doubt.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's obvious that they must have had some type of sanction or they'd even be liable right now.
No, as a matter of fact, when the film was released, George Jackson's mother filed a $20 million suit. Some brothers that had been involved with George Jackson while he was in the prison got involved in a protest movement around trying to stop the film from being distributed, right? So it was, oh, y'all gonna get rid of me. This is insulting. Huh? Wait a minute. Yeah. Would you come up to the mic, please? Harold, you started that. I will remember you for that for the rest of your life. I'm not finished. I might not even let him come up here.
In fact, that Angela Davis was also an advisor on that film.
Say that again.
I said Angela Davis also was an
advisor
too on the film. Also this, the way someone is in personal life down in the block, you understand, and that who is to say that like George Jackson's character, you understand, was not like that around guys close to him. You understand what I'm saying? See, because that these guys who advised that film live with him, and plus that Angela Davis was his you understand, friend. So then she knows you understand how their thing was. So that although although his books, you understand, says one thing, but in a man's personal life, he can be altogether different. You understand what I'm saying? Like that. So you understand that the film was a love story. It says that on the thing. It was a love story to show how that him and like Angela came to like together. You know, that's all that was, a love story.
All right, I'm not going. You got one comment? All right, come on. I'm not going to stay here.
Excuse me.
Yo, the speaker's here.
The brother pivot off a good thing, right? Because I didn't like the picture, right? And I don't even know George Jackson, but I do have a lot of literature that would describe it to me. And the reason why I didn't like the picture, because I know that anybody doing time, they always have a lot to say, because their freedom means more to them than anything as far as getting out beyond these walls. The brother didn't do that much talking as far as they had him at a point that he was on the spiritual plane, which was cool, but I'm talking about as far as rapping. He was a revolutionary. His people or somebody was a revolutionary. His brother, he was in some kind of organization dealing with the Panthers and different things. But I'm saying they should have had him speaking out more, because a man like that in a predicament like that, he expressed himself more. I also didn't like the part when he died, because I feel that when they killed him in that yard, that he had better sense than to bring a move like that, because I was dealing with the picture on the spiritual plane again, where he was mostly trying to tune in with his inner self or beyond. But I was saying that I didn't like the way that he died, because he knew good and well that trying to get beyond the walls is a heavy thing, and he know that in order to go, that was the way out. But as we all say, he went back to the Creator. I didn't like the picture.
Okay, I'm gonna make one final statement, then I'm gonna call up here. Can I? Be cool. I will recognize this, and it was something I saw all throughout the movie, and I think Hadiki made this point up there, was that they didn't give Brother George Jackson any political identification. You know, they did not recognize who he was identified with, who he was working with, and where his brothers and other people that were associating with him political identification was. They didn't recognize anywhere throughout the picture the existence of a Black Panther Party or that kind of a movement at that time, and that was one of the things that was whitewashed in the picture. But I'm quite sure after the speaker opens up, there'll probably be a lot of more dialogue in that particular area, right? Brenda?
Tonight is the 33rd week of To Say Their Own Word. And the topic tonight is Convicts as American Leaders, Causes and Effects. And we have with us a person who has been here already and has been very instrumental in this entire program. He is the person that wrote the book called The Victim as Criminal and Artist. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, there are copies up in the library. And it's a very, very important book in terms of the exploration of the significance of prison literature in the United States today. Now, this particular person is a professor of English and American literature at Rutgers University, and he came down on a very ill airline, and he really should be applauded just for coming on this airline, bothering to get on the plane, that is. He's got a resume that's about this thick with publications, not only about American literature, but about science fiction and a whole bunch of different professional articles about prison literature. He's probably one of the few people in this country that is interested in prison literature and does write professional journal articles about it. His name is Dr. H. Bruce Franklin, and let's give him a double welcome for all of the problems he had getting here. I hate flying. I don't really know what to do. Stick it around. And if it moves a little, just move it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really agree with what Eddie was just saying, because it's been a while since I've seen that movie, but that is the problem with the movie. It doesn't provide the context, George Jackson's life, who he is, what his significance is. And that's one of the main things I'm going to be trying to do tonight. The title of my talk is Convicts as American Political Leaders, and then a subtitle, From Malcolm X, Killed 1965, to George Jackson, Killed 1971. When I was here last October, I spoke about the literature created by prisoners in America. And I gave an overview of the history of this literature, and I tried to explain why this literature has become so important since the mid-1960s. Well, of course, as everybody knows, the key figure in modern American prison literature is Malcolm X. And if I were going to sum up the core of that talk that I gave in October, I would again quote the 3 sentences that Malcolm spoke in Detroit in 1964, just a few months before he was assassinated. Malcolm said, "Don't be shocked when I say that I was in prison. You're still in prison. That's what America means, prison." Well, let me just recall my main argument for that talk in October, because I'm going to try to build on that. First main point is that from the point of view of the Afro-American people, America has always been a prison. Second point is that that vision of America as a prison is right at the heart of Afro-American culture. Third point, today, as the American empire begins to disintegrate, as its economy begins to come unglued, and various things happen in our society, other groups are beginning to share this vision of America as a prison, which is projected in Afro-American culture. And then what follows from this, the fourth point, therefore, the literature created by prisoners in America becomes more and more generally relevant to other Americans who sense a growing loss of their own freedom. But what I want to do tonight is look at the opposite side of this dialectic, the opposite side of the contradiction, the opposite of imprisonment. The opposite of imprisonment is pretty obvious. If you're in prison, what's your main desire? Right, to get out, to be free, right, obviously. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is, I see, the significance of Malcolm X and George Jackson ultimately is their messages, how to get out, how to be free. Just as what I talked about in October was how the literature by American prisoners helps other Americans understand that they too are prisoners, that they are not free. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is how the political theory developed by these two great leaders has helped other Americans understand how they can get out of prison, what they have to do if they want to attain their freedom, and how these things interrelate. Now, as we all know, a prison is a place that people are kept in. This means that the prisoners inside a prison are kept out of every place but the prison. In other words, the essence of a prison is confinement, separation, isolation. Now, the main achievement of American convicts as political leaders in the period that I'm going to be talking about, the period beginning in the mid-1960s, going up to the early 1970s, the main achievement was to show how to break out of that isolation, to begin to understand the difficult path toward freedom, toward liberation. In that talk in October, we looked at some of the main points of American history to comprehend the evolution of the vision of America as a prison. And tonight, what we'll have to do is look at some of the main points of world history lying behind and in the political theory developed by Malcolm and George Jackson. Now, if we study the autobiography of Malcolm X, we look at the whole book, and I'm sure most people here have read that book, we can see that the first 16 chapters of the book deal with Malcolm's ever-deepening understanding of what it means to be a black man in America, what America means, and what great obstacles stand in the way of freedom. Malcolm discovers the most horrifying aspects of racism. The night riders attacking his home, one of his earliest memories as a small child. The crushed body of his father, probably killed by night riders. His teacher in high school, forcing him away from what he wanted to be, which was to be a lawyer, and telling him he should just do something with his hands, maybe be a carpenter. And then later on, things like the hidden lusts of the white men that he is forced to pimp for in Harlem. And then finally, the discovery of American justice. And perhaps his most terrifying discovery in those first 16 chapters is the way that he internalizes the racism, coming to hate himself, hate his own body. Remember the famous scene of the first finally realizes is trying to destroy part of his body, to change it into something else, to conform to an image of what's supposed to be beautiful, handsome, acceptable. So Malcolm, in those first 16 chapters, explains to us how America makes us perceive the victims, that is, those at the very bottom of American society, as the criminals, and how America places the very worst criminals, the biggest robbers and mass murderers, at the very top, ruling over the rest of us. He takes us through the awakening he experiences in the Nation of Islam and shows us the political conflict that surrounded that fatal moment in American history in November 1963, when the President of the United States fell victim to the great unsolved crime of our time. Then come the final 3 chapters of the autobiography, beginning with chapter 17, which is entitled Mecca. Malcolm leaves the United States for the first time. He goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca as a Muslim. Now, that pilgrimage to Mecca by Malcolm is one of the great historical voyages of discovery. It was, in fact, the dialectical opposite of Columbus's voyage, the so-called voyage of discovery of what was called America. Because of that voyage out of America, Malcolm was able to begin to chart the path out of the maze, the labyrinth of 1963, the road out of the American prison. Malcolm now shows us that the very essence of the American prison is racism, that racism is at the heart of American history and American psychology, that racism is the foundation of the entire system. Racism is the foundation of capitalism. Racism is the foundation of imperialism. It's not just a set of attitudes. For Malcolm now comes into direct contact with the world outside the American prison and begins to look at the American prison in an overall historical context in the history of the world. Now, it's really important for us to understand this history of racism, because there's no way that people in America are ever going to be free unless we understand this very clearly. Racism is not just a set of attitudes. Racism is a very recent phenomenon looked at historically. Racism has a specific function. Racism begins in the 15th century. Before that, there's no such thing as racism in the entire history of the human race. I mean, we can look at Greek and Roman frescoes on the walls, and we see black Africans and other people, and there's no sense of any difference according to race. Or we can look at India, where Krishna, the god, is usually imaged as a black man. And there's no conception somehow different. St. Augustine. We can look through pre-15th century literature. We will not find any reference to the fact that St. Augustine was a black African, which he was. But in the 15th century, in Spain, the doctrine of racism begins in the Catholic Church, developed by the Jesuits, with the idea that the Moors, who have been living in Spain for centuries, don't have a soul and are not human beings like the other people. Now that takes on a whole new importance worldwide with the so-called voyages of discovery in the 15th century by people from Spain and people from Portugal. And of course, the very concept that these are voyages of discovery is basically a racist concept. That is, these other lands don't exist until white Europeans get there and discover them. Because the people who are living in those other lands, according to this racist idea, are not really people. So we look at late 15th century, Columbus's voyages, 1492 and so forth. We see the setting up of Portuguese colonies in Africa and India, Spanish colonialism in what's called the New World. And ruthlessly, armed with this racist ideology, justified by this ideology, it was possible for Spanish colonialism to come into the New World and begin to wipe out whole populations of people in the late 15th and early 16th century, literally working to death the people of the islands of the Caribbean. And because they wiped out that population, they needed new workers to work that plantation. And of course, that is the introduction of slavery, African slavery, into the New World, which begins right at the beginning of the 16th century. The Spanish Empire began to bring Africans to take the place of the native peoples that they had completely wiped out in the so-called New World. But all this, despite the genocide, despite the slavery up to this time, this was I mean, it's hard to say this, but really it's true. This was a relatively mild form of racism compared to the racism which was developed in the 19th century. And we look at slavery in the 18th century in America, in those British colonies. It was different from slavery in the 19th century because it was not based on the theory developed in the 19th century by Darwin and by a group of American so-called scientists called the American School of Ethnology, that black people were a different species of being, a subhuman species. Now that theory, developed by Darwin, developed to justify slavery in America, is also the theory which is used by the British Empire to seize most of Africa and hold it as outright possessions, colonies. America, of course, develops as a slave state. In Blood in My Eye, the book that George Jackson finished just before he was murdered in prison in California. In Blood in My Eye, George Jackson attempts to shock us into understanding what America is by using the terms USA to describe a country that could either be the USA, United States of America, or the USA, Union of South Africa. And that's a very important part of the political understanding unfolded in that book, that you can take that term USA and describe big parts of these two societies, and you don't know which one someone is talking about. Here is what the Encyclopedia Britannica has to say in the main article they have on racism. Quote, this is a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Netherlands and Great Britain were responsible for the growth of the most racist colonial societies that the world has ever known, namely South Africa, the United States, and Australia. And then they explain some things beyond the obvious. In the United States, virtual genocide against the Indian groups was accompanied by the institutionalization of a slave plantation system, and after 1865, of racial segregation and discrimination against the so-called emancipated Afro-Americans. In addition, a number of states adopted racially discriminatory laws against other non-white groups, notably Asians, in the field of immigration, marriage, and political rights. As late as World War II, tens of thousands of American citizens were interned for several years in camps solely on the basis of their Japanese ancestry. This is all quoted from the encyclopedia. Well, just as the USA, Union of South Africa, has its native quarters and its tribal homelands, the United States of America, that other USA, has its ghettos, its barrios, and its reservations for so-called Indians. And as for racial concentration camps, well, all we have to do is look around this room. Now, in the 19th century, as the United States was moving from an outright slave society to one based on segregation and wage slavery, at the same period, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and the lesser European powers were completing the colonization of the entire non-white world, dividing it up among themselves. It was at this point that the old Spanish Empire was being torn apart by national liberation movements. Most of the countries of South America won their liberation from Spain. And those national liberation movements against the Spanish Empire were spreading to the last few places that remained, places like the Philippines and Cuba. It was right at that point that the United States took a decisive move into the 20th century with the doctrine of manifest destiny, that it was the destiny, manifest, clear, of the United States to be a worldwide colonial power. And so the United States moved into that situation taking over the last few pieces that were left of the Spanish colonial empire, seizing the Philippines, seizing Cuba, and turning them into direct colonies. This was also the period, and this is very critical to understand, that a new form of imperialism was being developed. In the old form of imperialism, the colonial powers just outright owned the colonies that were their colonies. In the new form of imperialism, sometimes they didn't own them outright. These countries were supposedly free, separate, independent. And of course, the trick was that the colonial powers, the capitalist powers, controlled these colonies through economic control by owning the means of production inside those other countries. You see, we have to make the relations between that situation and the situation inside the so-called United States of America. Well, there we were, at the end of the 19th century, the colonial powers had the world all neatly divided up. But then, because of contradictions among those colonial powers, contradictions inside the capitalist system, World War I began. The first war fought around the world and for worldwide purposes. That was a war fought basically, not what you read in most of the history books that you had in high school. That was a war fought by the white European capitalist powers to redivide the non-white world, the colonial world, among them. But the problem was, and this of course is where we really start getting into our history, the history of our century, the 20th century, the problem was that right in the middle of that war, that was going to be a war to redivide the world, something happened, and that was the first communist revolution, the revolution in Russia in 1917. And the world has not been the same since, because from that point on, oh, the tape is being changed? Do I stop? Okay. Oh, okay. Maybe why don't you can you just yell, because I won't see it probably. Is it okay? How much longer do we have? Okay. Okay, from that point on, there was beginning to develop an alternative to capitalism, an alternative to imperialism. And of course, the history of our century is really a history now of the fight, the confrontation, the struggle between two different social systems. The 1930s saw a worldwide economic crisis of the capitalist system. And inside that crisis in the capitalist system, there began to emerge national liberation movements in different parts of the world. In Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and also within the United States. This was a period of the growing sense of the reality of Afro-American history and the history of the other oppressed peoples inside the United States. And this, of course, was also the period with a tremendous rise of forces moving for socialist revolution. In response to this, in response to the crisis of capitalism, in response to the emergence of the national liberation movements and movements for socialist revolution, came a modern phenomenon, and that is the phenomenon of fascism, which is, I think that when we look at George Jackson's last book, Blood in My Eye, although we might have disagreements about some of the strategy and tactics in parts of that book, the theoretical analysis that he gives of fascism is extremely valuable. You might disagree with some of it, but you cannot ignore that. George Jackson is a major theoretician of what fascism is. And George Jackson's theory of fascism derives from the fact that he was a black man in America, and specifically a black man who at a very early age became a convict in America and was able to see fascism in its clearest form. That is the form as it exists inside the prisons of America. George Jackson has several points in analysis of fascism. First of all, that fascism has to be understood as a form of capitalism. explicitly what he calls corporativism. That is, fascism is a form of the rule of the giant corporations. The giant corporations, as they move into a new period, the crash of 1929, the crisis of the capitalist system of the 30s, saw the end of free enterprise capitalism as a dominant system. There may be some small stores and things around after that, but free enterprise capitalism was finished as a system that ran a society. From this point on, the capitalist societies of the world were going to be societies characterized by monopoly capitalism, state capitalism, gigantic corporations interpenetrating with the state apparatus. And Jackson develops the theory of that. Second part is that fascism is a form of capitalism in a period of crisis. It's a form of capitalism when capitalism is fighting for its very life. Why? First, from internal contradictions, the actual contradictions in the economic system, and secondly, when capitalism is under revolutionary attack. That is, capitalism can be very mild and pleasant as long as it's not threatened, but threaten its existence, and then you see something else. This leads to his analysis of what he calls the three faces of fascism in Blood in My Eye. How many people got a chance to read this before? Well, a few. It was photocopied, and are copies still available? It's just an extremely important book. Okay, this is on page 123. The first phase of fascism is what he calls out of power fascism. That tends to be almost to be revolutionary and subversive, anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. That's the first phase of capitalism. And that's very important for us to understand, that fascism doesn't always appear in its most vicious and obvious form. For example, here's a direct quotation from the German Nazi Party of 1933. Quote, "We members of the National Socialist Party," that was the Nazi Party, "condemn the extremists of both the right and the left. Neither the communists nor the reactionaries can deal with Germany's problems or bring our country the future it deserves." So the Nazis, the worst fascists, presented themselves in what Jackson calls the first phase of fascism as moderates, someplace in between all these extremists. In other words, liberals, which is interesting. The second phase is one in power but not secure. That's still threatened. And he said, this is Jackson now. This is the sensational aspect of fascism that we see on screen and read of in pulp novels, when the ruling class, through its instrumental regime, is able to suppress the vanguard party of the people's and workers' movement. And then the third phase of fascism exists when it is in power, and securely so. During this phase, some dissent may even be allowed. So we have to be able to recognize all three. Fascism, in its most terroristic stage, Jackson, of course, describes that second phase, and this is the one that Jackson sees directly from a certain angle of vision, that is, from his own experience. And herein lies one of the crucial reasons why the political theory of George Jackson, a black American convict, is so deeply, so profoundly revealing. The secret is that fascism, even in its most blatant, vicious, terroristic phase, still may not look like fascism to those who are reaping its benefits. Some people say, I don't see any fascism. Things are fine. I have a nice house in the suburbs. I can say whatever I want. Where's fascism? It's those who are on the receiving end who perceive most clearly the hideous features of the fascist beast. Here let me quote Aimé Césaire, the great theoretician of black culture from Martinique. A rather long quotation, but it's worth hearing. He says, this is in this very great book, which I hardly recommend if you can get a copy, called Discourse on Colonialism. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to greed, violence, race hatred, moral relativism. We must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped, and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France, they accept the fact. He, of course, is speaking to a French audience. Civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. And he goes on, a poison has been instilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely, the continent proceeds towards savagery. People are surprised. One fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific reverse shock. The Gestapos are busy. The prisons fill up. The torturers around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, how strange. But never mind, it's Nazism. It will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, but the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. Yes, it'd be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. And that is the great thing I hold against pseudo-humanism, that for too long it has diminished the rights of man, that its concept of those rights has been and still is narrow, fragmentary, incomplete, biased, sordidly racist. And that is why this theory is now being understood to be more generally relevant. Because the methods applied to non-white people inside the United States are now also beginning to be applied to white people. George Jackson, in his earlier book, Soledad Brother, gives the kind of autobiographical and historical awareness that Malcolm had provided in the autobiography of Malcolm X. The victim perceived as the criminal, the concentration camps of America. Now, in Blood in My Eye, Jackson raises this knowledge to the level of political theory, giving us one of the most provocative and useful theoretical definitions of fascism. Today, the relevance of Jackson's theory becomes far more general. In Césaire's terms, many of those who before were the accomplices of fascism now become its victims. The United States of America, the annual arrest rate has now passed 10 million. That's not traffic arrests. Those are felony arrests, 10 million a year. The United States today has the highest rate of incarceration of any nation in the world. That's right. A higher percentage of the citizens of the United States are in prison than any other nation. But we see, in addition, is a gradual encroachment of fascism in American life. It's a new thing. You see, when I flew down here, we all went through a procedure. No one apparently thought anything about it anymore. That is a procedure in which the packages of suitcases and so forth are all fluoroscoped, and people walk through a metal detector. And if they fail a metal detection, they sometimes get a body search. That's just a little well, so what? Identification papers, numbers. The other day, I was with my 17-year-old son in a department store. He said, check this out. He said, look around. He said, you can't stand any place in this store without being under constant closed-circuit TV surveillance. And sure enough, it was about every, I'd say, 15 or 20 feet, there was a turret with 4 little eyes gradually turning around every inch, where there was actually an overlap every inch of the store. Well, so what? I'm not stealing anything. What difference? We get used to that electronic surveillance. Someone else in my family works in a place where he found out that every single room in that place is constantly monitored, audio monitors to a central agency. That is, every single room was constantly bugged. Anything that was being said in any room in that workplace. See? Oh, well, what difference does that make? See, it's here. It's here. The apparatus is all in place. But why is it here? Why has this happened? I mean, this stuff's all very recent. It's all happened since that period. That's the beginning of the period we're talking about tonight. That is the period roughly marked by the killing of Malcolm X in 1965. Why has all this just appeared around? Well, we have to return to our overview of world history to understand that. Okay, back to the 1930s, there's the worldwide crisis of capitalism, the rise of national liberation movements, movements for socialist revolution, the emergence of out-and-out fascism in Germany and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Romania and Bulgaria and so on. World War II, somewhat different war. Part of it was, again, okay. Okay? Part of it was, again, an attempt by the colonial powers to redivide the world. There was an element of that. And there was also Hitler's dream of destroying communism and establishing a worldwide dictatorship of the most extreme racism and militarism. Well, Hitler's dream, we think, was crushed. Or was it? Question. The old colonial empires, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on, during World War II had to do something which they didn't want to do. In order to survive, they had to use the non-white colonial peoples of their empires in their armies as combatants. In World War I, they had often used black African people in the armies and so forth, but basically that was just to carry things and do some of the work for the people doing the fighting. In World War II, in order for these colonial empires to survive, they had to arm many of the colonial peoples. They had to bring those non-white peoples into that war and have them kill white men in combat. Very dangerous thing for them to do. At the end of World War II, those old empires were weakened and tottering. World War II, remember, ended in 1945. In the next 3 years, between 1946 and 1949 alone, 1/4 of the world's population won national independence from the empires of Europe and the United States. Then in 49, that same year, another 1/4 of the world's population carried out a socialist revolution in China. We're talking about a 3-year period. 1/4 of the world's population achieves national independence, another 1/4 carries out a socialist revolution. That's half the world's population. And it kept spreading. In 1954, for example, the French colonial forces were smashed in Vietnam and the rest of Indochina. And here again, you see how they get caught in their own contradictions, because they had to use Algerian troops to fight against the Vietnamese. And when the Algerian troops went back to North Africa, those disarmed Algerian troops helped spread the great liberation movements in North Africa. And Algeria soon won its independence in a very bloody war against France. In 1959, socialist revolution finally broke through into the Western Hemisphere with the victory of the revolution in Cuba. In sub-Saharan Africa, Africa below the Sahara, ignited by the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya, the British African colonies rapidly began achieving their national independence, 59, 60, 61, 62. By the middle of the 1960s, the entire non-white world was ablaze with liberation movements. As the old colonial empires were beaten militarily and politically, the United States assumed the role of the world's policeman and the major imperialist power, bringing into its empire all the fallen pieces of the old colonial empires, bringing them in as neo-colonies, caught in the clutches of the giant multinational banks like Chase Manhattan. The United States tried desperately with bribes and bombs to turn back the tide of history, to keep the peoples of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America under neo-colonial domination. And in Vietnam, the United States was defeated militarily and politically by that rising tide of national liberation. Now, one of the reasons for that defeat, as we'll see, was that those national liberation movements had now spread inside the United States, actually had spread inside the military forces that the United States was sending there. Just like the the brother back there, he knows about it, obviously. Just like the Algerians used by the French in Vietnam, Afro-Americans, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans used by the US empire in Vietnam, that national liberation movement spread from Vietnam into the non-white peoples inside the so-called United States. It was right in that scene, in 1964, that Malcolm X made that historic voyage to Mecca. As he enters the Muslim world, he has an astonishing revelation where he finds people of all races, from the most blonde, blue eyes, to the black Africans, literally embracing each other. He says in the autobiography, in that chapter, Mecca, they were of all complexions. The whole atmosphere was of warmth and friendliness. The feeling hit me that there really wasn't any color problem here. And then this amazing sentence, you see remember what I said at the beginning. The next sentence, the effect was as though I had just stepped out of a prison. Well, then Malcolm makes another startling discovery, that the newly independent nations of the world look to the Afro-American people as a fellow nation. He realizes that the first step in the strategy for liberation must be to start thinking internationally, to remove people's minds from the prison of American nationalism. Quote, he says, the first thing the American power structure doesn't want any Negroes to start is thinking internationally. When Malcolm travels to Ghana, he is hailed as an embodiment of international solidarity between the non-white peoples of the world and the Afro-American people. An African newspaper put it this way, quote, "An extremely important fact is that Malcolm X is the first Afro-American leader of national standing to make an independent trip to Africa since Dr. Du Bois came to Ghana. This may be the beginning of a new phase in our struggle." Well, what do we see here? Clearly we see an exemplary American convict as an international political leader, not just an American political leader. Malcolm X was an international political leader as a black ex-convict. Yet when Malcolm returns to America, he finds himself portrayed in the American press as the sinister villain, the so-called hate monger, responsible for the first of the so-called long, hot summers that had just broken out. For this, remember, was the summer of 1964, when the first major black urban rebellion since 1943 broke out. And I'm sure people here know a lot about it, but just to refresh our memory, remember the summer of 1964, the summer of 65, 66, 67. 67 was the big ones in Detroit and Newark. And then in April 1968, the week after Martin Luther King, another ex-convict, by the way, was killed, rebellions in 125 U.S. cities. Now, of course, the media liked to pretend that this was something that just happened in the past and was all over. Well, I guess it's getting harder to make that pretense when we look at Miami, the place. You know, these names are great. Liberty City, you know, the name of the black ghetto in Miami? Well, people probably saw a little of that on TV. Well, into that turbulent scene of the mid-60s, Malcolm X now kept stressing the internationalism of the Afro-American struggle, the need to link up with the worldwide movement for national independence and socialist revolution. One of his favorite devices was to explain to his audiences the use of the term minority as a verbal trick, how people think they can't do anything because they think of themselves as a minority. He puts it really beautifully in a speech he makes in December 1964. Remember, this is just a few months before he was killed. This is it. This is not in the autobiography. It's in Malcolm X Speaks, a collection of the speeches. "Here in America, we have always thought that we were struggling by ourselves. And most Afro-Americans will tell you just that we're a minority. By thinking we're a minority, we struggle like a minority. We struggle like we're an underdog. We struggle like all the odds are against us. This type of struggle takes place only because we don't yet know where we fit in the scheme of things. We've been maneuvered out of a position where we could rightly know and understand where we fit. It's impossible for you and for me to know where we stand until we look around on this entire earth. Not just look around in Harlem or New York or Mississippi or America. We have got to look all around this earth. We don't know where we stand until we know where America stands. You don't know where you stand in America until you know where America stands in the world. We don't know where you and I stand in this context, known to us as America, until we know where America stands in the world context. George Jackson continues to develop this internationalist understanding of Malcolm X in Soledad Brother, that collection of letters published before Blood in My Eye. He puts it this way. It's a very important statement. He says, "Do you know," of course you do, he's writing to Angela Davis, "the secret police, CIA, etc., go to great lengths to murder and consequently silence every effective black person the moment he attempts to explain to the ghetto that our problems are historically and strategically tied to the problems of all colonial people. It's no coincidence that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King died when they did. Malcolm X had just put it together, 2 and 2. Then he goes on to talk about Martin Luther King, who, it is true, just before Martin Luther King was killed, he started making speeches saying that the struggle of the Vietnamese people was like the struggle of black people in America. Jack, you remember what was on his lips when he died: Vietnam and economics, political economy. And from this, George Jackson sees the necessity of alliances worldwide. We must establish a true internationalism with other anti-colonial peoples. Then we will be on the road of the true revolutionary. Only then can we expect to be able to seize the power that is rightfully ours, the power to control the circumstances of our day-to-day lives. So the first part of the theory, which is really the essence, the essential part, everything else is built on that, is internationalist understanding, an understanding of how the struggles of oppressed peoples inside the United States links up with the struggles of oppressed peoples around the world, specifically the national liberation movements of non-white people. The second point is the development of the understanding of armed struggle, and that the methods that have been advocated before were methods that could not work. This develops originally out of a theory simply of the need for armed self-defense. Malcolm began to speak out forthrightly for the need for armed self-defense. And he put the alternatives in terms of his a very important phrase in a speech he gave in 1964 called the ballot or the bullet. At that point, it looked like there was still a choice. When Malcolm was cut down in a hail of bullets on February 21st, 1965, the struggle was about to enter a new phase. Malcolm already had begun to perceive the connection between the Vietnamese struggle against the US empire and the Afro-American people's fight against the very same enemy, the big criminals who ruled the society. The next few years, from 1965 roughly into the early years of the 1970s, marked the birth of an authentic revolutionary movement inside the United States. The urban rebellions continued to intensify. And from those urban rebellions, links began to develop with the rebellions that were beginning inside the military forces in Vietnam. By 1968, 1969, much of the army in Vietnam was an almost open insurrection. 1968, that's a nice year, very important year. 1968, the Republican Convention, which was held in Florida outside Miami. The rebellions that spread out of Liberty City then were stopped only 2 miles from the Republican Convention, and they were stopped when that Republican Convention was ringed with tanks. 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, in which people came, the anti-war movement came to protest against the railroad of that convention. And of course, they were being attacked by Mayor Daley's police and so forth. And the 101st Airborne was ordered into action against the anti-war demonstrators. Dozens of black paratroopers from the 101st Airborne refused to go and refused to participate in suppressing the anti-war movement. Over a dozen were arrested and prosecuted. That was a very important link developed in the two great movements that were rising simultaneously in America. The climax, of course, of those spontaneous urban revolts came in April 1968. But those spontaneous upheavals had obvious limitations. I mean, what finally happens from a riot? The primary question that now emerged was, what is the actual goal of the mass movement? What is it that will satisfy the needs of the people whose needs are now unmet? And this is, of course, the third great point of the theory developed by Malcolm and George Jackson and others. And that is that the only thing which can possibly bring this about is socialism. Here Malcolm in 1964 and 1965, like hundreds of thousands of others, possibly millions in the next few years, realized that the only answer, the only solution for the deep problems of America in the late 20th century, the only solution is the destruction of the capitalist system and the development of socialism. Malcolm puts it in these terms. He's still, he has to speak a little bit around the corner because it is only 1964. This is a speech in December 1964, and I'll just read you a few excerpts from this. Among Asian countries, whether they're communist, socialist, you don't find any capitalist countries over there too much nowadays. Almost every one of the countries that has gotten independence has devised some kind of socialistic system, and this is no accident. This is another reason why I say that you and I here in America, who are looking for a job, who are looking for better housing, looking for a better education, before you start trying to be incorporated or integrated or disintegrated into this capitalistic system, should look over there and find out what are the people who have gotten their freedom adopting to provide themselves with better housing and better education and better food and better clothing. None of them are adopting a capitalistic system because they realize they can't. You can't operate a capitalistic system unless you are vulturistic. You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist. You show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. He cannot be anything but a bloodsucker if he's going to be a capitalist. He's got to get it from somewhere other than himself, and that's where he gets it, from somewhere or self. So when we look at the African continent, when we look at the trouble that's going on between East and West, we find that the nations in Africa are developing socialistic systems to solve their problems. This is the richest country on earth, and there's poverty, there's bad housing, there's slums, there's inferior education, and this is the richest country on earth. Now, you know, if those countries that are poor can come up with a solution to their problems so that there's no unemployment, then instead of you running downtown picketing City Hall, you should stop and find out what they do over there to solve their problems. This is why the man doesn't want you and me to look beyond Harlem or beyond the shores of America. As long as you don't know what's happening on the outside, you'll all be messed up dealing with this man on the inside. I mean, what they use to solve the problem is not capitalism. What they're using to solve their problem in Africa and Asia is not capitalism. So what you and I should do is find out what they are using to get rid of poverty and all the other negative characteristics of a rundown society. Now, this is the ideological position that Malcolm X had reached at the time of his murder in 1965. Where Malcolm ends is precisely where George Jackson begins in Blood in My Eye. I mean, there is a development of this theory. It's not the creation of some single lone genius. And George Jackson picking up at the point in March 1971, 6 years later, in that very first letter of the book, he says, "We have finally arrived at scientific, revolutionary socialism with the rest of the colonial world. I was hoping that you wouldn't get trapped in the riot stage like any other very sincere brothers. I have to browbeat them every day down here. They think they don't need ideology, strategy, or tactics. They think being a warrior is quite enough." And of course, that's what this book is all about, the scientific theory, the strategy, and tactics. By the late 1960s, several important revolutionary organizations had emerged from the mass movement with a clear consciousness that the goal of the movement must be the capitalism and the development of socialism. Now these organizations were trying to provide coherence, leadership, planning, strategy, theory for the struggle. Now, to give a history of revolutionary black organizations in this period, I think we would probably all recognize the importance of the Black Panther Party. As Eddie pointed out, talking about the movie Brothers, that is what's really missing from that movie. The Black Panther Party very rapidly, for historical reasons, passed from being a little tiny local group in Berkeley and Oakland, California, to being a national party perceived by the United States government as a serious threat to its existence. By 1970, the Black Panther Party newspaper had a circulation of 150,000. Now, this is that year, 1970. Well, look at it this way. The same year, 1970, the Wall Street Journal conducted a poll that determined that 83% of all black people considered themselves revolutionary or sympathetic to revolution. So the strategy and tactics set forth by George Jackson in Blood in My Eye were not idle speculations. In fact, they came in the context of a life and death struggle being waged between the Black Panther Party and the United States government, and in the context of a crucial struggle within the Black Panther Party itself. Now, of course, one of the main things about the Black Panther Party is the Black Panther Party was attempting to find the forms of alliance that could exist between black people and sections of the white population. And that, of course, has always been very dangerous for the capitalist system. Segregation itself came about, all the Jim Crow laws came about because in Reconstruction after the Civil War, there was an alliance between poor whites and the freed slaves in the South that developed some of the most progressive government structures ever existing in the United States. That's what had to be smashed by the capitalist system. But in this 1970 period, there was this crucial struggle between the Black Panther Party and the government, and inside the Black Panther Party itself. In April 1968, the Oakland police had ambushed a group of leaders of the Black Panther Party, killing one of the three co-founders, Bobby Hutton. In 1969, police and federal agents raided Panther offices all across the country. I'm sure many of you know this. And of course, but the interesting thing, I think, or one of the interesting things, is that these raids were a sign of the success that the party was happening. It goes back to George Jackson's theoretical understanding of the second phase of fascism. If the capitalist system, corporativism, monopoly and state capitalism, if it's not threatened, it looks perfectly benign and harmless and friendly and innocuous. Nothing to it. Any threat, the mask comes off. And that's what happened in 1969. Raids sweeping across the country. A very striking example took place in Sacramento. Jesse Unruh, who was the majority leader of the state assembly in California, in Sacramento, the state capital, he gets up in the state assembly one day and he's scolding the other members of the assembly. He said, "Do you people realize that at this moment the Black Panther Party is feeding more breakfast to more school children than the state of California is?" The next day, the Sacramento police raided the Panther headquarters, shot up the place, destroyed all their equipment, ran off with their files. In Chicago, the Panthers were carrying out one of the missions defined by George Jackson, transforming the criminal consciousness of the gang structure of the Keystone Nation into a revolutionary consciousness. At the same time, they were forming a strong united front with Chicano organizations and working class white revolutionary organizations. They set up what was called at that time the Rainbow Coalition of working class white, Chicano, and black revolutionary, and were trying to coordinate activities. Well, that was too dangerous to let go by. Just before 5 a.m. on December 4th, 1969, federal agents and local police struck in a carefully planned and coordinated raid, machine gunning Fred Hampton and Mark Clark to death while they lay in bed, secretly drugged by police agents. 4 days later, police struck in Los Angeles, 5-hour firefight employing helicopters and a tank. Geronimo Pratt led what was really a successful, and really the first successful armed self-defense conducted by the Black Panther Party. That evening, many hundreds of police, state and local police, surrounded the Panther National Headquarters in Berkeley and the Panther headquarters in San Francisco. And because of the success of the armed self-defense that morning in Los Angeles, it meant that for the first time, there was a mass defense of Panther headquarters as they were being raided. It was a mass defense that was coming partly out of the black ghettos of Oakland, West Oakland, and San Francisco. But it was also coming from other people. It represented the beginnings of a very powerful alliance. For example, there were carloads of armed white factory workers that went up to defend Black Panther Party headquarters in San Francisco that night, December 8th. And it was for that reason that those two headquarters were not attacked. The police backed off. Other attacks came later in New Orleans, where there was a successful defense, and in Detroit. And in both New Orleans and Detroit, there was a massive outpouring from the community in defense of the party. And other things, of course, was happening. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, which had been organizing black factory workers, had managed to change the jury selection system in Detroit. So when the Panthers, who were finally arrested in that Detroit raid, came to trial, every one of them was acquitted because, in fact, for the first time, large numbers of black people were actually being brought into that jury system. 1971, which was the immediate context of Jackson's theory in Blood in My Eye, there was the split in the Black Panther Party having to do with some of the tactical questions that Jackson raises later in Blood in My Eye. There was also the rise within the white movement, the anti-imperialist movement, of an underground armed organization, that is the Weather Underground, which conducted bombings as a form of protest. Hundreds of new organizations were appearing, and there were frequent splits on strategy and tactics. Now, I think that it's fair to say that the period 1971, 1972, the period, obviously, which I try to frame in this talk by taking the killing of George Jackson, of course, what happened at Attica as a result of partly of the killing of George Jackson. But that 71, 72 period really represented the crest of a wave of the movement. And from 72 to the present, I think we would have to say that this has been a period of repression and reaction. All the gains that people won in that 64 to 72 period have been under attack. Many of them have been taken back. All kinds of educational programs, social programs have been undone. Their financing has been cut out from them. There's the kind of apparatus, the mechanisms that I described of surveillance, of police participation in organizations and so forth, have been successful. The repression has done a pretty good job of smashing organizations. But organizations have persisted. And in fact, at this point in 1980, as far as the organizations go, the level of theoretical understanding is much higher than what existed in 1972. People have begun to understand that you have to be serious about studying theory if you want to accomplish anything. You cannot just run out there spontaneously and expect to have very successful results when you're facing the kind of machine that the revolutionary movement is facing in the United States. At the same time, there's also a higher understanding among the masses of people. And I think that the main difference is that we have to see the difference between a protest movement and a revolutionary movement. Because practically all the movements of 65 to 71, 72 were really pre-revolutionary. They were protests. Even the urban rebellions were protests. And a protest is essentially some way of expressing something to the people who have power. We're not going to put up with this anymore. That's the ultimate protest. We're going to riot. We're going to bomb something. It's a protest directed to make the people who are in power do something different from what they're doing. Now, there's a tremendous difference between a protest and a revolution, because the purpose of the revolution is not to convince the people in power to do anything. purpose of a revolution is to take power away from them. And to carry that out, you have to have an organization, you have to have a strategy, and you have to have tactics. It's in this context that people in the 1980s turned back to reread the writings of these two American convicts, Malcolm X and George Jackson. The theoretical understanding developed by Malcolm X in 1964-65 has proved to be the starting point for revolutionary consciousness since the mid-60s. On the other hand, the questions, the tactical questions posed by George Jackson in 1970-71 in Blood in My Eye have proved to be the unanswered questions of the 1964-1972 period. It's because those questions weren't answered that it was possible for the state to destroy the revolutionary organizations that existed then. These are the questions that need to be answered before the movement can advance significantly beyond the level it reached at the beginning of the 1970s. And what I hope, and this is really the end, I hope that in our discussion, we can make some advances in our understanding of these questions. In the last great wave of the American movement, crucial political leadership came from American convicts. This may be true again as the conditions give rise to another great wave of the mass movement as the economy begins to disintegrate. So I think that people here who are serious about these questions have a great deal of responsibility because a lot of people are looking to you for leadership. That's the end. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a little tired. You have to forgive me because I was going to rest. Okay. I was over here thinking, and you ran so many things through my mind. It was like speed reading all over again. You know, I enjoy your talk, right? And I wish I could talk like you know, but I guess that takes a lot of studying also. I wish in the near future that you probably could come back here maybe once a month or whatever you can and teach us some other subjects besides Malcolm X, Jesse, George Jackson. But I learned some tonight about these great men, right? Like you say, again, we do need to read as much as we can on the Afro-American or the Belialian people so that we can sharpen up and do what we have to do in this society, because it's not a thing that is all just two-sided race. It's a thing that we all just have to get together and combine as well, get the job done regardless. I also want to say on behalf of myself and the penitentiary that we really enjoyed, you know, you getting here because the will of God that you're playing did land in Baltimore. I also want to say that you did lift my, you know, soul a little bit, or my spirit, I should say, because I was over there resting and I was ready to go out, but you were saying so many beautiful things and my eyes just kept crying, like, because dealing with Malcolm X and George Jackson, Martin Luther, this makes me feel good to know that the creator or whoever's in charge, which we usually say Allah, right? Whoever's in charge, it makes me feel good to know that besides having successful black men, that we also have successful white men, because I look at things two-sided, you know, opposite. But I like to say in the near future, in closing, I'm going to conclude that I hope some kind of way that you can get with Brenda Vogel or even Marshall Conway, who's in charge of Say Your Own Words at this particular moment, that you get in charge and try to come back and fly again. And I hope that your plane, jet, or limousine, or whatever it be, get here a little early, because I enjoyed your talk.
Well, I really appreciate that. Well, you know, but so one of the main things I don't know if I really, you know, got this communicated well, is that my own understanding of these questions comes directly from Malcolm X and George Jackson and other leaders of this period. That although I had a lot of formal education, you know,
yeah, I understand you quite well.
That in fact it was this, the theoretical writings of people like this that led me to realize that what I had learned in school was all false.
But okay, I'm going to conclude because I know somebody else can answer that for you. But what I want to say that I'm glad that by you being a doctor or, you know, so on a high scale field, that you are able to be qualified to give us this information about some of our black successful people, you know, and it's not too many Caucasians or any other kind of colors they want to put on people that will come in the penitentiary and talk about Malcolm X and George Jackson, because they all hold a high responsibility within our hearts. So I'm just saying, as again, I appreciate you coming. I wish that you come again.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I was digging on what you said, right? And I said I was digging on what you said, right? And like, I know you came to the end of it, right? So you know what the end gonna be, right?
What the end will be?
Yeah, what the end gonna be.
Who knows what the end will be?
You studied it though, right?
Yeah.
You know what the end gonna be, right?
Yeah. I don't think so. See, well, we may be talking about two different things, but the way I look at the whole process, it's one of gaining freedom. And freedom
Right.
means the freedom of people to decide what they want to happen.
But
So we can't predict
but socialism
what we'll
isn't
do
freedom.
with our freedom.
Socialism isn't freedom and capitalism isn't freedom, right? So by that being, what I'm saying, like, you studied this, so more than likely you wasn't on time, you was on eternity, right? So by this being, you know, like you saw the end of it, right? So, you know, like, I done sit back, you know, like, hey, I'm not, you know, like, if I want to put myself in a category, I'm gonna say, I'm a pimp, right? So by me saying that, right, you know, like, and then living in the time I'm living in now, right, and knowing that I got to go, you know, so, you know, like, just like I was born, I'm gonna die, right? So by that being, you know, like, looking at my life, you know, and looking at the principalities and all this, right? So I know it's gonna be an end to all that, right? So just like gonna be an end to my pimping, right? So by that being, you know, it's gonna be into everything, right? So, you know, I studied George, I studied Malcolm, I studied Martin, right? I studied Marx, you know. I studied, you know, capitalism, you know. So, you know, like I studied a little bit of everything, you know. I went to college for a while and everything, but when I looked at all of it, right, studied all of it, and I seen how it gonna go, you know, so I see it gonna blow, you know, like nuclear weapons, man, it's here, right? So and all this here, so it got to become, you know, with all the bucking, with the little people and everybody, you know, and then the big people, then everybody wanted to jump over here and say this is right, and then jump over here and say this is right, you know, and then they found out neither one of them is right, you know, so something got to go. But then by me jumping on eternity, man, instead of getting on time, you know, like I just know, you know, what's after that, you know. So just seeing all that, right? So, you know, like that's why I don't even worry about getting out of jail or anything like that, right? You know, I don't worry about nothing, you know. I don't even worry about nobody putting no knife in my back, you know, or nothing like that, you know. But I'm trying my best, you know, like, hey, man, respect everybody, because it got to go in.
Okay, to begin with, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come in and share your position with us. And Malcolm X, George Jackson, a lot of the brothers that you quoted, I've studied them myself, and I concur entirely with their theories and their positions. And I think it says a lot for their theories and their positions that a man who has acquired doctorate degrees in the various philosophies and what have you can find it in himself to agree with what they've said. And a number of issues I want to speak on. First, socialist form of government and a capitalist form of government. Now, I'm in favor of a socialist form of government. I feel that a socialist form of government would be more equitable than a capitalist form of government, whereas Malcolm X and George Jackson and a number of other brothers have said capitalism exists on exploitation. In other words, someone has to be exploited for capitalism to persist. And if you don't have that exploitation, then you can't have capitalism. So that in itself speaks against capitalism. Now, another thing on the issue of a socialist form of government as opposed to a capitalist form of government, a lot of people have negative concepts of what a communist form of government is or a socialist form of government is. And this is based on the concept that they have been given by the capitalist mass media, you know, the instrumentalities of mind control that the capitalist system has at its disposal. So they base their concept of socialism on this image that they have been given by the capitalist government without really taking time to reflect long enough to realize that, of course, the capitalist government would not give you a positive image of something that's directly contrary to
Exactly
it.
right.
And on the Black Panther Party, now I followed them very closely. I was very young when they was first established in 1968, but I followed them very closely and I have studied the history of them in great depth. And I think the primary mistake, the most significant mistake that the Black Panther Party made was that it professed armed struggle, but at the same time it exposed itself to the enemy that it professed to be against. And in your developmental stages of armed struggle, you cannot expose yourself to the enemy, particularly if he's economically, militarily, numerically, and technologically superior to you. You can't expose yourself to him. If you do, that's suicide. And that's exactly what the Black Panthers did, which was probably their fatal error. Now, on the issue of armed struggle, personally, I support armed struggle not as a total means of resolution of the problem of oppressed people in the world, but as a means accompanying other means. Like, in other words, I don't feel that education theory, mass demonstrations, boycott, strikes can be dispensed, and that armed struggle by itself should be retained. You know, I feel that armed struggle should be accompanied by those various other forms of resistance that have proven themselves effective. You know, but at the same time, once again, dealing with armed struggle against a system, like you made the point of how the machinery that one would be contesting if one was to oppose the United States government with armed struggle, which is a very significant point because the United States government has a very intricate intelligence apparatus, even despite what people are saying now because of what happened in Iran and because of what happened in Afghanistan. People are professing a doubt about the American intelligence community, which I disagree with that because I feel that what happened in Iran, they knew about that before it actually developed to that point. And what happened in Afghanistan, they suspected it before it came up. And whether or not they moved according to their information, that's something else. But I don't think this is a reflection on their ability to accumulate intelligence and to act according to it. Now, another theory that I have in reference to what happened in Iran and what happened in Afghanistan was that these type of things may have been presented to the American public in the way they have as a means of moving the American public to be sympathetic towards taking the shackles off the CIA and the FBI that were placed on them. You know, so they more or less allowed this to happen so that they could say, well, see, we told you that was going to happen if y'all tied us up the way you have. Now that they done made that point, they said, well, you know, they got Reagan, Bush, even Carter is saying now, well, look, we're going to cut them loose again. We're going to let them go for themselves, you know. And a lot of the legislature that was passed to restrict the CIA and the FBI, President Carter, the Ronald Reagan, George Bush, even Anderson to some extent, and definitely Kennedy, you know, which Kennedy is not what a lot of people think he is. You know, a lot of people are basing their concept of Kennedy on this brothers, and particularly John Kennedy. But he's not what a lot of people think they are. He's not the liberal that people give him credit for being. Not to say anything against him past that, but just to make that point that he's not the liberal that a lot of people think he is. And all of these individuals are saying that if they're elected president, they will give the CIA, the FBI, Army intelligence, military intelligence, the various other wings of the military, they will give them that freedom that they had under Nixon administration and even more. The justification they use for this is they say, well, if we do this, things like Afghanistan, things like Iran will not reoccur, But I see that as an excuse. So the last point I want to make before closing is on the subject of the military wing of the movement, revolutionary movement. Like you made the point that protest is one thing and a revolution is something much more. And that's definitely the case. I think in a revolutionary movement, I think one of the primary prerequisites is that, and Malcolm, George, and a number of other theoreticians agree with me on this, is that you have to have two separate wings of the movement. You have to have a military wing if you're going to be into that armed struggle. And then you have to have a political wing. And if you have a military wing, the military wing must function in total clandestines. You cannot have a military wing running around trying to get TV exposure, what have you. So, to gain recognition, they have to be totally clandestine, particularly in a situation such as the United States, because if they're not, they will find themselves subjected to the same thing that Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, Angela Davis, Geronimo Pratt, Leonard Peltier, to name a brother who was a Native American leader. You didn't mention him, but he was what they call an Indian, but he was a revolutionary functioning out of that camp. And if you expose yourself and you profess armed struggle, you will be subjected to these same things that they were subjected to. The United States may profess to be the most humanistic government in the world. You will be shot down in the bed at 3 o'clock in the morning while you're laying between your woman's legs, if that's the case. And they would think nothing of this, covered up in the press. Or you might get something on the news about 2:30 in the morning when everybody's asleep or drunk or whatever. They're flashing on the news about what happened. And of course, that gets by everyone, but it gives them puts them in a position where they can say, well, yeah, we did publicize it. But anyway, to draw it to a close, the political wing of the movement should handle anything that has to do with exposure, theory, organization, anything that must occur above ground that requires exposure have to be handled by the political wing. And the military wing must be totally clandestine, in order for a movement to survive. My closing statement is this. I feel that inevitably armed struggle will arise in the United States. Now, I don't know whether I see, as you made point, that the United States government is moving swiftly to make that an impossibility, or at least an improbability that if that does arise, it would not be able to be successful. But I feel that maybe, in the next 20 or 30 years, you will have something of the nature of what occurred in the 60s, but perhaps on a more intense scale, as you had individuals in prisons who are becoming more and more aware of the reality of their situation. You have people in general who under economic hardship are becoming to a point where they can see the United States situation for what it is and not for what they have been taught to believe that it is, And I feel that in all probability over the next half century, something will arise of the nature of armed struggle. Whether we'll be successful or whether we'll be on a ethnic level or whether it will be social, involving oppressed people or a class kind of struggle. I don't know, but I do feel that something of that nature will arise, and I do feel that prisoners or ex-convicts, as we are referred to, will play a significant part in that struggle. Thank you.
Well, can I just take a few minutes and respond, because you raise a lot of important things. I hope you're doing some writing, because you do have a lot that's very important to say. The first point, I just want to reinforce that thing about media. We just have to remind ourselves every day that 99.999% of all the information that we're getting we're getting from the capitalists. We're getting from their television stations, their radio stations, their newspapers, their magazines, their churches, everything. Okay. I do want to say a couple things about Iran and Afghanistan that you brought up. First of all, on Iran, I think you're absolutely right about that little side move to unleash the CIA. In fact, we ought to, well, really the two things are connected. We got to cut through the media. The CIA prepared a report that told the government that if the Shah of Iran were admitted to the United States, the embassy would be seized and the embassy personnel would be taken as hostages. So the government knew that was going to happen before they let the Shah in. They made no attempt to beef up security at that embassy. The only sensible conclusion that a person can come to if you examine it is they wanted that embassy to be seized and they wanted those hostages to be taken. Why? Two reasons. One, they knew that there was going to be a huge glut of oil and they were afraid that oil prices would collapse. What they were able to do, remember, it was the whole Iran thing that allowed them to double the price of gasoline. But that was secondary. The primary thing is that the giant multinational banks are technically bankrupt. They don't really have hard assets. What they have are bad loans from third world countries that they're just rolling over. One bad loan replaced with another bad loan. The one chance they had to get hard assets was the $8 billion on deposit from Iran. So what they did was to use the seizure of the hostages, which they had set up knowing those hostages would be seized, to get the $8 billion. And there's no way that they want the Iranian government to release those hostages. Because if the hostages are released, the $8 billion got to go back. And you analyze that so-called rescue mission, and you'll see that the only possible thing, I mean, we have to be idiots not to understand this, that the purpose of that rescue mission was to get a firefight going in Tehran so that more military force could be brought in to rescue the rescue mission, and so that the $8 billion could be kept, and so control could be taken of the oil fields again. On the question of Afghanistan, well, we could get into that. It's a long, complicated subject. But one thing that's very important to understand now about Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. Talk about the CIA. The CIA is the main coordinating agency for the heroin trade in the United States and Europe. You read the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia for documentation on this. The main area they were using heroin before was in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Golden Triangle centered in Laos, where the opium poppies were grown. The juices were flown out on Air America, an airline run by the CIA, and then refined in Mexico and the Philippines and brought in. When they lost that main heroin area, the poppy area in Southeast Asia, they developed a new area in Southwest Asia, in an arc stretching from Pakistan across northeast Afghanistan and into Iran, and then the route goes up through Europe from there. What they're producing in that area is heroin that is much purer, much more powerful than the stuff that was coming in from Southeast Asia. And this is one point I think people shouldn't fudge around about. One of the purposes that the CIA has in pumping heroin into the oppressed communities of the United States is counterinsurgency. Heroin is one of the main weapons that they're using against the people's consciousness. People shouldn't be liberal about that. And methadone is another. Methadone, I don't know if people realize what methadone was. The original name of methadone was Dalphine, because it was developed by the Nazis as a drug to create a slave population. Everybody knows methadone's more addictive than heroin, does more damage to the body, and that's why they have methadone clinics. They got two fronts for those drugs. Now, on the last question, that's a question I think we really need to get into, because here I do have some differences with George Jackson's theory. Jackson's theory in Blood in My Eye is basically that you have a military apparatus, and then a legal party which is doing things like serve the people programs, organizing demonstrations, and so on. Well, the problem with that theory, I mean, it's a really difficult practical problem, is that if that military organization moves, what does the state do? They wipe out the open legal organization, which they did. Now, what is the alternative? I think the problem is, in the analysis which sees the separation between political and military, because military is a form of, military is just a form of political. The distinction is not political and military. The distinction is not legal and illegal. The distinction is between the mass organizations, the mass movements, and the cadre organizations, which are, by their very nature, underground. I mean, the classical Leninist strategy is that there is an underground organization which is not known to the state, which coordinates from inside all the mass struggles, whether the mass struggles are political or protest or serve the people programs or strikes or whatever they are. There has to be that core cadre group, people with a high degree of discipline, a high degree of theory, and a high degree of organization to do the coordinating from inside the mass movement, but not separated from it. But with that, we should probably talk about that.
How you doing? I'd too like to extend my gratitude and thanks, for coming. I'd like to comment on some the implications on some of the things that you mentioned. Initially, you had said that Malcolm had said that everybody in America was in a prison. That the foundation of prisons, was racism. I totally agree because then you also said that we went into the inception of racism, how it started. 15th century, where it had its highlight. And it found its stronghold in the church. And, I think that has important implications because, even now, racism, is still perpetuated, in American society. And it still, poses as a prison, in that it poses as a prison, in that it kills our reality, undermine our ability to receive, to accept each other as human beings. And I think that's a very significant, grave problem, in America today. And we also seen, in the 15th century, the development of Western global imperialism, which I don't think, was a coincidence, that racism had started at the same time. In fact, I think, that, racism was designed to help, support exploitation, that like you had said, it really was no problem. People didn't really have no problem, with each other, as different ethnic groups or different races, but people had came, put racism in the thing to exploit other people. In fact, not only this exploit really one particular class of people, because you exploit all people when you rob people, of the mind to accept each other as human beings, that's exploitation. And I find, it started in the church, and I want to go back to that because today, we find in the church God-given, in a Caucasian image, and all children that go to church, and see this and accept a Caucasian as their image of God, that goes to promote in their minds racism, and it goes those who are not like that, who are not of that same skin color, it goes to perpetuate in their minds inferiority. So us as prisoners, you said, you highlight the point that prisoners, are leaders, they had more time to study, analyze some of our problems. I think that this should be one of our focal points, because the bottom line was that America is a prison, because of racism. And I also like to mention Malcolm. Malcolm was a Muslim, I like to call him Malik El-Haj Shabazz. He get the name El-Haj when he went to Mecca. And I think it's significant, that in Mecca, that where he said he's seen, and experienced the real true sense of brotherhood, in Mecca. And he had also, advocated Islam as a means, as a mechanism to help eradicate racism. I like to make that point too, because a lot of times we quote Malcolm, and sometimes we quote him out of context because, he was part, of a whole lot of different things. Like one time he was in the Nation of Islam, then he went Hajj, he made his Hajj, and he changed some of his concepts. But you got a lot of people that still like to quote, when he was in the Nation of Islam to identify what he was after that. So I'm saying it's important that we keep the brother in context. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to develop a little bit more that one point you made about prison being a microcosm of society for the racism and the contradictions in prison, because George Jackson talks about that a lot in Soledad Brother, and how the prison is split between the white prisoners and the black prisoners with the. Yeah, I know. Okay. What I was starting to say before we ran out of tape was the brother who had spoken right before had mentioned that the prison is a microcosm of racism in the society. And I think that's really important to understand, because George Jackson in Soledad Brother describes it in detail, and I'm sure people here are all aware of it. The key to it is the relationship of the white prisoners, because the state, in the form of the prison, is essentially telling white prisoners, well, you're not really prisoners, you're really white. So it's a question of identity. It just says, oh, you're really white, which means you're different from black. That's more important than you're being a prisoner. Or you see it in the factory. You're not really a worker like these black workers. You're white. So that at every level of American society where white people are oppressed and white people are exploited, and I mean the prison is pretty much as bad as oppression can get.